self-diagnosis is a difficult topic. I'm in the middle of my own self-diagnosis journey, which will hopefully lead to an official diagnosis. And I've been on this journey for, I guess, for a year now almost. And in the middle of that year, I sat down in my basement with a camera and a microphone, and I talked about my self-diagnosis journey, where I was at that point. And because life happens and just keeps happening, I didn't get to edit that video and finish it. It was sort of an attempt of doing the thing that I'm doing in my recent videos on my channel, which is to just talk to the camera with minimal editing, with no editing really, but this one will have a little bit of editing, and it will have an art piece on one side, which will mostly be in real time, but slightly sped up at parts, just to make it go with the video, and it will have a few cuts here and there, and it is, as content creators, we always think about the standards we're setting, that I have to learn more and more about how to do this YouTube stuff. Subscribe, press the bell icon, support on patreon.com/KimHolm, or support by becoming a member. That YouTube stuff is actually important, because that will ensure that I can make more of this, but also the technical stuff, how to talk to a camera, how to set up the lights, the sound, and how to deliver the things I need to deliver, but in a format that is hopefully entertaining and interesting to you. So this video would have been very easy to just scrap and say, no, I can do it better. But while talking to the camera alone in my basement, I touched upon feelings and truths that I can't just call back. It was in that moment, of that moment, on this journey of figuring out what's happening in my brain and in my life. And I hope that if you are bipolar, or think you may be autistic and ADHD, or if you have people in your life that are struggling with these things, I hope this video, this little snapshot of my journey, can be helpful to you.
Don't self-diagnose, please see. Sorry, I really don't want to single out this one comment, because there's a lot of misconceptions about self-diagnosis, and it usually comes from a good place, because people understand that there are some real and some potential problems with people self-diagnosing a mental disorder or self-diagnosing for clout, I think, is the idea. And I really just wanted to use this comment as a jumping off point to discuss some of the things in my own self-diagnosis journey. First, figuring out that I was ADHD, then that I was ADHD and bipolar, and then getting diagnosed for both, and then just one. It's complicated. And now, this summer, coming to the screaming realization that underneath all the other things that have wreaked havoc on my life for 44 years, underneath it all, the me that is there fits the diagnosis of autism, or specifically autism with ADHD. Now, I will read the full comment just because I thought there was a few interesting points. Now, first of all, my name is Kim Diaz-Holm, also called Den Unge Herr Holm, and I'm primarily an artist. And I also talk publicly and openly about my struggles with mental health. And that's mostly been based on being diagnosed bipolar type 2. And we'll get into what that means later, because it might not mean what you think it means. But first, I want to go read the whole comment, and I don't want anyone to try to find the commenter or anything, or let people be wrong. I love your approach to myth and monsters, but please don't self-diagnose. Why? Ego is not a professional, it's personal. And the same ego is what makes us feel empathy with symptoms. But also the ego likes to be right when it has the power of knowledge. Send you a big hug, looking forward to what's next. And that was the one that started with, no, please don't self-diagnose, or whatever. And now, first of all, the line that ego is not a professional is personal seems like a sort of truthism that sounds good and is probably good in the right contexts, but it doesn't really apply everywhere. And especially when it comes to at least my journey of self-diagnosis, I think it is almost a little bit upside down. The ego, again and again, has been one of my greatest barriers to discovering the causes and also the treatments of why I keep messing up my life, in a sense. So I I've always had a big ego. And some of that is probably because of having good parents who supported me and who nurtured me. And also, intellectually, in terms of what you call um, my intellectual capacity, I've always had a mind that works pretty well, and we'll get into the specifics because that's a part of the diagnosis journey. And these two things, both the good intellect and the sometimes oversized ego, has been stumbling blocks, both for me trying to get help from the Norwegian healthcare system and the mental health care system, and for understanding the problems that I have. So, from the very start, I've always considered myself different. I've always viewed myself as different, but I've also taken pride in my difference, and at times nurtured my difference. And I've enjoyed feeling like an outsider until I don't enjoy feeling like an outsider anymore. And that sort of balance has been hard. And in my early teens, or probably when I was like 10, 11, 12, I started developing these reoccurring depressions. And by the time I was 12 or 13, I had suicidal thoughts every single day. Trigger warning, we just talked about suicidal thoughts. I'll try to get through this video without too many jokes, but that's a part of how I've always masked whatever happens inside. I can mask it with a joke. So the suicidal thoughts were not the joke. They were something that came after sort of crashing completely with the school system for many years. And viewing myself as lazy and unruly and aggressive and a liar. Most of all, as a liar, as someone who would say and do anything to get out of school. And that developed into these reoccurring depressions. And the suicidal thoughts were never, very few times were they all that serious. I've never seriously attempted suicide, but I'm also pretty sure that if, I am the sort of personality that if I were ever to attempt suicide, I would make sure I would make it. I wouldn't do a scream for help, because if I'm supposed to scream for help, then I will rather scream for help. And there were times when instead of attempting suicide, I screamed for help. And one of those times was when I was 17, and some friends of mine brought me to the psychiatric emergency room in Bergen after I had told them of my, at that time, constant depressions. And then I got my first diagnosis. After about 20 minutes or half an hour tops of talking to a psychiatrist, he gave me the diagnosis written on paper of dysthymia, which is a sort of a mild depression or mild depressive symptoms that may be there for a few years and then disappear. Now, the problem was, in order for me to be diagnosed with dysthymia, the doctor had to disbelieve every single word I said during our very short talk, which he apparently did. Because if it was dysthymia, it would not have been as heavy as I described, and it would have only lasted for a couple of years. At that point in time, it had lasted for at least 5 or 6 years. But the doctor gave me, a potentially lethal dose of antidepressants and diagnosed me as dysthymic. And that was the only written down diagnosis I had for a few years. Later, in my early 20s, I started hearing about ADHD and ADD, and I recognized that there was something there that was very similar to how I experienced the world, and I started trying to get an official ADD diagnosis. The problem was, at the time, I was partying a lot, and I was self-medicating, and one of the things I was self-medicating with was illegal drugs, mostly cannabis. And since I couldn't honestly say to my psychiatrist that I wouldn't take any cannabis in the period of the diagnosis, she couldn't diagnose me. If I had been drinking every day, she could have diagnosed me, but since I touched cannabis, she couldn't. That was, at least how I remember it, or how it was described to me, that was the rule. So a few years later, around the age of 27, I started doing more serious attempts at getting out of my continuous mental health problems. And at this time, I remember that I had watched the documentary about Stephen Fry and his fight against bipolar disorder. And I started thinking, hey, there was something there. There might be something there. And I went to the psychiatrist trying to get a ADHD and bipolar diagnosis. And I was open about this, that this was what I thought was right. And I had read up a lot about it. I read a bunch of books. I read a bunch of life stories. And, this made sense to me. But the fact that this made sense to me didn't mean that my ego was on board. Now, for the ADHD diagnosis, my ego didn't really mind because, sure, my ego would like to be unique in its problems, but it didn't really mind that there was some sort of name for my uniqueness. But the bipolar diagnosis, even though I first self-diagnosed and then chased the official diagnosis, was a huge and crushing blow for my ego. Because it didn't just mean that, I was manic depressive and that I was exactly like in the Jimi Hendrix song or whatever. Manic depression. Do 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 dunk 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 dunk. That's not. Great song. It also meant that my perception of myself had been, for almost all my life, seriously wrong. Because every time I had been in a depression and it had started to lift, my ego had perceived this to be caused by the work I put in, by the work I put into my art, by the work I put into, trying to take care of my physical self, even though I didn't do much exercise at the time. And every time I started coming up from my depressions, I started thinking, yeah, I found the cure. I finally found the cure for my depressions. And then it went upwards. And I didn't only find the cure for depressions. I found the cure for the world, for everything. I would never be depressed again. I would just make tons of art. I didn't need sleep. I didn't need friends. I only needed my great big intellect and the creativity of the universe. And after a week or two of barely sleeping and being insanely creative, I would crash. Because these were my hypomanic periods. And intellectually, when I started reading about bipolar disorder, I understood, I recognized the pattern. But that hurt. Because my ego doesn't like to be wrong. And that diagnosis meant that my ego and intellect, but my intellect takes less badly to being wrong. It meant my ego had been wrong again and again and again and again, and not even noticed it. So intellectually accepting that I was bipolar, that came easy enough. But emotionally accepting it, taking the consequences of it, that was fucking awful. And it literally crushed my ego. So in my early 30s, I had a bipolar type 2 diagnosis and a ADHD diagnosis. But even though I was taking my treatment more seriously, I was taking exercise, or at least I was starting to think about exercise, starting to try to implement a physical routine in my life more seriously. And I was understanding more and more of myself. I still felt that there was something missing. At this point, I also started working doing art classes for autistic children and teenagers, and I didn't do a whole lot of it. I did, once a week um, for a few years, and I also did some art classes and art clubs, comics clubs for children and teenagers for many more years, and I started recognizing a lot of autistic traits in others, and I also started recognizing that I had an affinity with autistic people. I had the ability to communicate, not with every autistic person I met, but if they gave me a little bit time, I had the ability to find a way to communicate, even with a lot of people who usually weren't communicative at all towards anyone. And at the same time, when I was looking for what else was wrong with me, I was 100% certain, and I only grew more certain, that whatever it was, it couldn't be autism. Because I wasn't like that. I saw the kids with Asperger's, as it was called, and autism, and I wasn't like that. There was an affinity, an overlap, but they were totally different from me. I was a fighter and a rascal and a party boy. And they were not. So then, in searching for what more was, what more we could find about me in terms of diagnosis, I got to do a neurological test with a very competent doctor. And at this point, it's sort of Um, I perhaps I need to explain a little bit about how I was interacting with doctors, because for most of the psychiatrists and psychologists I've gone to, and there's been quite a few, for most of them, I've always felt that I had to talk down to them to get them to understand. Up until that point, there had really only been one psychologist that I went to that I didn't feel I had to talk down to or to dumb myself down for. And the neurological test I did sort of explained why. And it's because even though I was sort of mid-depressed, I mean, lightly depressed at the time, and I did all the tests in one day instead of being smart and doing it in 2 days, and I was really exhausted afterwards, but the doctor didn't really notice, which is something I didn't know until I read the journal where she says that I complained about being tired, but it didn't look like it affected anything. But the tests showed that intellectually, I function very well. I function in the things that they measured, probably better than most of my doctors. It doesn't mean I'm a better person. It doesn't mean I know more about psychology or psychiatry. But in terms of just having a brain that thinks deeply about issues, there was a reason why a lot of psychiatrists and psychologists didn't seem to be able to keep up with the pace of my brain. Now, one thing that happened during that neurological test was that one of the parts of it was about my attention, checking if I have attention deficit disorder. And I remember very well that test because it was about pressing space or some key on the keyboard whenever something appeared. And I remember this very well because I remember the texture of the wallpaper. I remember the half sunlight coming in through the window through those sprinkles. I remember the ticking of the clock. I remember getting completely sucked into this challenge as if it was the greatest computer game I had ever played. So I due to exhaustion or due to circumstances, I got into a state of flow while doing my attention deficit disorder test, and I aced it. Which doesn't necessarily mean that I usually ace my attention. It just meant that I was in a very rare flow state at that point. But these test results resulted in me losing my ADHD diagnosis, but keeping my bipolar diagnosis. And I was, I didn't mind. The ADHD wasn't really a part of my identity. So yeah, didn't mind. And I had already tried ADHD drugs, Ritalin, and it was one of the very few drugs that have ever worked as it should on me. But I couldn't keep taking it because of high blood pressure. So I didn't really, okay, I can't take Ritalin anymore, but I don't need, I'm not married to my ADHD diagnosis. So I didn't mind it being taken away, even though I realized and also said that I did experience a kind of powerful flow state during one of the exercises. In hindsight, maybe that should have been paid more attention to. But the doctor was extremely competent and did a very good job. But she had also only known me for a few hours. I had been there once to a welcome talk and then to the testing, and that was it. For all the other diagnoses, getting the bipolar diagnosis and getting the ADHD diagnosis, that was hours upon hours, and talking with my parents and getting references from my school and all that stuff. But taking it away was literally one test. Okay, so where am I going with this? This summer, a lot of things had happened, especially the last year. Some of the things I can't talk about because I talk about my mental health and not the mental health of those around me. More, I have to get some water. Okay. Another thing that had happened joining TikTok was another thing that had happened over the last few years. And TikTok had exposed me to a lot of different neurodivergent creators and people with life experiences much different than me and perspectives often quite similar to me. And I had sort of noticed over a long period that some of the people that I resonated most with, some of the mutuals that I talked with and really resonated with, either had autism or a combination of autism and ADHD. And then in the early summer, I did a portrait project where I drew portraits of a bunch of my followers and a bunch of mutuals mostly from TikTok. And a shocking amount of the conversations that went, in my opinion, that went the best and were most giving for me were with people who were diagnosed as autistic and ADHD. And one of those people actually sent me a book. They asked me if they could send me a book, and I gave my address and didn't think any more about it. And then I went to Spain with my family, and then a bunch of accidents happened, and I suddenly, first almost as a joke, started entertaining the idea that, I might be wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have. Maybe I've always said that I'm not autistic. Maybe I shouldn't be so quick. Maybe I should check this autism thing out a little bit more. And at that point, I had and at that point, I had already for many years had a special interest in autism through the teaching, through TikTok and mutuals and fans. And I had read more and more. But one of the things I hadn't read up about was the combination of autism and ADHD. So when I jokingly started being open for the idea that, maybe I should check out if I have autism once again, because I don't. I can't, because I'm not autistic. And then I started reading up about and listening to podcasts and videos about the combination of autism and ADHD, and also how it overlaps with bipolar. And I was crushed. For weeks, I couldn't think about much else. And it was hard to breathe. And I recognized so much of myself in this thing that I knew that I couldn't have this. And I started doing the types of self-evaluation questionnaires that you do in a official diagnosis. So the autism quotient and some other such test. And the first results were sort of, were kind of, they weren't like a shock, because on the autism, I have all the numbers written down, because of course I do. But on the autism quotient questionnaire, I scored like, likely autistic, at the bottom range of, you're probably autistic. This is worth checking out. So, and that didn't really come as a shock, because I had known there was overlaps between all these things. And then I started taking more of the tests that are designed for adults and for people who mask, such as the RAADS revised test, as the CAT-Q test, and a bunch of others. And I didn't only score autistic. I scored. This is a bit hyperbolic language, but I scored off the charts autistic. If now autism is a spectrum, of course, but if it was a straight line, on some of those tests I would be almost at the top, very high. I would be the king of masking autism. No, I'm kidding, but for me the results were shockingly high, and they were consistently shockingly high. And I didn't go straight out and say, now I'm diagnosed autistic. I had to let this sink in. And I had to read up more, and I had to study more before I was certain. And most of all, I had to convince my ego, because my ego absolutely hated this. So with my bipolar diagnosis, my ego had hated it because that meant that I had been wrong regularly for years. Every time I was hypomanic, my ego had been very wrong. This meant that autism meant that my ego had been wrong all my life. That whenever my ego had championed a solution for my problems, had helped me get good at masking, at lying, at screaming to myself in my head to get to the gym, at feeling proud of how controlled I was, of how I could hold all this shit in. And this was wrong. My ego, doing its best to protect my sorry self, had done me wrong. And ever since I self-diagnosed myself as autistic, my ego absolutely fucking hates it. Because it's smart enough to know that, you know, if it has been wrong once, or I mean maybe for a few thousand days, then it can be wrong again. And it doesn't like being wrong. I didn't think filming this would make me emotional. I have actually filmed attempts at doing this video a few times before, but it has never really been satisfactory for me. So those attempts were scrapped, and none of those were emotional at all. But now I'm feeling kind of emotional, and that's not to say it's hard for me to get emotional. I mean, after my intellect self-diagnosed myself as autistic, there has been a lot of times where I just feel crushed by it. I just started. Someone recommended I think it's a BBC series about autism on the inside or something like that, where autists get to make movies about their own life. And this was a few days ago, and I started watching it, and I got like 5 minutes or 2 minutes into it, and I just fucking burst into tears. And I was this is the problem of being me, but I was media savvy enough to turn on my phone camera and film a little bit of it, which I'll probably put on the screen. Here, look at me cry. Ooh. I don't know why I did that. There are a lot of problems with self-diagnosis. But there are also a lot of problems with diagnosis. For someone like myself, without putting myself on a pedestal, it's really hard to get any sort of diagnosis because, first of all, to most psychiatrists, I have to talk down. I have to dumb myself down. And they also have to see that this terrific mask I put on is a mask. And that when I tell them it's a mask, they have to believe it. And from experience, when you go to a doctor and you look quite well, and you say, doctor, I have problems with my mental health, they don't believe you. Because you're not supposed to be able to mask. You're not supposed to be able to trick them. But you are. And I am 100% certain that if I was, with the intellectual capacities I have and with my flair for storytelling that I have, if I went to a psychiatrist, if I was dedicated enough, I could get any diagnosis I wanted just by research and by lying. And they wouldn't know. And I know this because most of my psychiatrists didn't know when I was telling the truth. When you see someone online talking about their self-diagnosis, you should believe them. Not because there are there's all kinds of sickos out there. So now that doing self-help for neurodivergent people, being an ADHD coach or autism coach, that has become a living for some people. So sure, there's probably people out there faking their autism, and you have no way of knowing. You don't ask and look at their papers. You take their word for it when they say they have an official diagnosis. And even if you ask and look at their papers, you don't know. There are plenty of people that are intellectually much more capable than me, and that are bigger liars than I've ever been. So they might trick you. And so what? You shouldn't judge a person based on whatever official diagnosis they have or claim to have. You should judge them from how they act, how they behave, what they say, what they do, how they are. And in this hellscape we call capitalism, getting an official diagnosis is a luxury that a lot of people can't afford. I'm lucky. I live in Norway. I will hopefully, being someone with some resources, I mean, not monetary resources, but at least intellectual resources, I will pursue getting a diagnosis first through the public mental health care system. And if I don't, if they say, no, Kim, we've given you enough diagnosis, which is probable, because the Norwegian mental health care system isn't stacked with gold. They're all overworked, so giving some weird artist another diagnosis isn't really top priority, and neither should it be. So if I don't get a official diagnosis through there, then I will pursue getting it through private means, because I want this official diagnosis. And at the same time, I'm completely open to being wrong. But then you have to show me convincingly that I'm wrong. And no stupid comment on a random video is going to do that. Boring. Criticizing people for self-diagnosis is petty, is cruel, is not helping. Don't do it. Trust people, and if the people turn out to be shitbags, no matter what diagnosis they have, don't trust them no more. I think this is it. Thank you for watching, if you watched so far. I'm very interested in hearing what people have to say about this, because this has been a very, very different video for me. And there's so much I didn't have time or capacity to get into here, but I hope that you got something out of it. And if you are the person who commented and who got this ridiculously long video, then I hope you think twice before trying to devalue strangers' mental health online. It's not a big criticism. It's just, I understand. Just don't. Thank you.